Tori Amos had spent years learning how to hold a song, not perform it, not deliver it. Hold it, the way you hold something fragile that is also somehow heavy, with a specific tension of both hands, knowing that loosening even slightly would change the nature of what was being carried. She had studied classical piano from the age of 5. She had been admitted to the Peabody Conservatory at 2.5, the youngest student they had ever accepted, a fact that had followed her through every subsequent decade, like a credential she hadn't asked for and couldn't put down. She knew music the way surgeons know anatomy, from the inside with precision, with an understanding of where the weight was distributed and why, and what happened when you cut in the wrong place. By 1992, she had made something extraordinary out of that knowledge. Little Earthquakes was not a record that sounded like precision, which was the point. The precision was in how carefully the rawness had been constructed, how deliberately the exposure had been arranged, how much control it took to sound that uncontrolled. Critics heard a woman unraveling. What was actually on the tape was a woman who understood exactly how unraveling worked and had rebuilt it note by note. She was proud of this. She had earned the right to be proud of it. She had not yet heard Kurt Cobain play in the same room as her. The circumstances of that evening in 1992 were unremarkable in the way that significant things often are. No ceremony, no announcement, no particular reason for the two of them to be in the same space except that the music industry in that era was a small enough world that orbits crossed without planning. A gathering of some kind. The details blurred later, even for those who were there. The way the container of an experience fades while the experience itself sharpens with time. What Tori remembered, and what she would describe in pieces over the following years, was the quality of the room before anything had happened. It was a house, or something like a house. Warm, low-lit. The particular atmosphere of a place where people had stopped performing for the cameras because no cameras were present. People were talking. Music was playing from somewhere, low enough to be underneath the conversation rather than over it. She had known who Kurt Cobain was. Everyone had known who Kurt Cobain was by then. Nevermind had done what it did, had moved through the culture like a change in atmospheric pressure, and you either felt it or you didn't, and most people felt it. She had listened to the record with the attention she gave everything she thought she should understand. She had noted the production choices. She had felt the velocity of it, the deliberate abrasion, the hooks that arrived like things you had always known and were only now being reminded of. She had understood it as very good at what it was doing. She had filed it and moved on. She did not know this was a category of experience she was missing. You cannot know the shape of a thing that has not yet happened to you, cannot feel the absence of something you have never encountered. She had her framework. The framework was complete, or felt complete, which is often the same thing until it is not. He was in the corner of the room when she first noticed him. This was, she would learn later, characteristic. The corner, the slight remove, the quality of watching that was not surveillance but something more like curiosity that had learned to be careful. He was not performing disinterest. He was simply not performing anything, which in a room full of people performing their ease and their familiarity and their belonging, created a kind of negative space that drew the eye without demanding it. She found herself near him without having decided to move in that direction. They talked at first the way people talk at gatherings like this one. Surface conversation, the polite traffic of two people establishing that they are both present and willing to continue being present. He was quieter than she had expected. Not shy exactly. More as if the interior conversation was so continuous that the exterior one required a kind of translation lag, a brief delay while something was rendered from one language into another. At some point, the surface conversation ran out. What replaced it was not silence in the uncomfortable sense, not the silence of two people who have nothing to say and are waiting for someone to rescue them. It was something else. They were both still there. Neither made a move to leave or to introduce a new topic or to perform the gestures of wrapping up. The silence simply sat between them, and they let it. And after a while, it became the thing the evening was, rather than the interruption of the thing the evening was. Tori would think about that silence for a long time afterward. She had spent her entire adult life filling space with sound, had been trained from childhood to understand Silence as the absence of music, as the negative of the thing, as the space that music arrived from and departed into. She had learned to use it, the way all musicians learn to use it. The pause before the chord, the held breath before the voice enters, the deliberate withholding that makes the release mean something. She had never simply sat in it with someone and felt that the sitting was the thing. At some point during the evening, she could not say when exactly, because time had stopped organizing itself in the usual way, he picked up a guitar that was leaning against the wall nearby. Not with any announcement, not as a performance. He picked it up the way you pick up something familiar, without thinking about the picking up, your hands already knowing the weight and the shape before the rest of you has decided anything. He didn't play anything she recognized. It wasn't a song, or not a finished one, more the thinking out loud of a song, a phrase that went somewhere and then came back and then went somewhere slightly different. The way ideas move when they are still ideas and haven't yet been told what they are supposed to be. His technique was, from a certain perspective, imprecise. She could see that immediately. The hand positions, the approach to the strings, none of it was what she had been taught to look for when assessing whether someone knew what they were doing. She stopped assessing almost immediately, because what was coming out of the guitar was not imprecision. It was something that existed prior to precision, something that had not passed through the filter of correctness and had therefore not lost whatever it had before the filter. She had a word for this, or thought she had a word for it. Rawness, she had used that word in interviews, had heard it applied to her own work and applied it to others. But rawness was not the right word. Rawness implied something unfinished, something that would benefit from more time, more refinement, more of the process that turns material into music. What she was hearing did not need more of anything. It was not raw in the sense of incomplete. It was complete in a way that had nothing to do with the kind of completion she had spent decades learning to achieve. She had heard a great deal of music. She had made music that she knew was honest, had gone to places in her writing and recording that had cost her something real, that had required her to be in the room without protection. She knew what that cost. She knew the specific quality of the exhaustion afterward. What she was hearing now had not cost him anything in the way she understood cost. It was simply there, the way weather is simply there. Not because no conditions produced it, but because by the time it arrives, the conditions are invisible and the weather is just what is happening. She did not speak. He did not speak. The phrase on the guitar went somewhere she didn't expect, and then resolved in a way that felt inevitable only in retrospect, the way all true resolutions feel, as if they could not have been otherwise, as if the whole sequence had been leading there from the first note, even though she knew, from everything she understood about music, that it had not been planned. When he stopped, the stopping was as unannounced as the starting. He leaned the guitar back against the wall. The room continued around them. She thought about what she had just heard for the rest of the evening, which meant she was not entirely present for the rest of the evening, a fact she was aware of and could not do anything about. The thought was not fully formed yet. It was more a pressure than a thought, something pushing at the edges of a framework she had spent years constructing and reinforcing and trusting. The framework was, music is what you make when you know how to make it. The pressure was the sound of someone for whom that sentence was not the beginning of the question. She left without the thought having resolved itself. This was uncomfortable. She was not accustomed to leaving things unresolved, had built a practice and a life around the specific satisfaction of taking something apart until you understood how it worked and then putting it back together better than you'd found it. She was very good at this. It had served her in ways she could not fully count. It did not serve her with the things she was carrying home from that room. The thing she was carrying home was not a problem with a solution. It was more like a new kind of quiet, a silence that had a different quality than the silence she had known before, that had a different weight, that suggested there was something on the other side of it she had not previously understood was there. She went back to her piano. This was always where she went. The piano was the constant, the place where things that could not be understood any other way could sometimes be understood. She sat at it for a while without playing. Then she played. What came out was not what she had been working on. It was something that went somewhere unexpected and resolved in a way that she did not plan. And when she lifted her hands from the keys, she sat with the sound as it decayed and thought, I did not know I knew how to do that. She played it again. It was still there. Not a trick of the moment, not a fluke of the late hour and the strange evening. It was something she had not had access to before, or something she had not known she had access to, which amounted to the same thing in practice. She sat with it for a long time. She did not tell anyone about the evening for a long time. Not because it was a secret, but because she did not yet have the language for what had happened. She was a person who was very precise about language, had spent years finding the exact word, the exact image, the sentence that could carry what she was trying to carry without losing anything in transit. The thing that had happened that evening resisted language in a way she was not used to encountering. What she eventually said in an interview years later, when asked about the artist who had changed the way she worked, was careful and incomplete, which was itself the most honest thing she could offer. She said, there are musicians who show you a new technique, and there are musicians who show you that technique was never the point. The second kind is rarer, and you can't learn what they know. You can only sit next to it for a while and let it rearrange something. The interviewer asked if she could be more specific. She said, not really. She meant it. Kurt Cobain died in April 1994. Tori Amos had been one of the last people to speak with him at length in the weeks before, a fact that became part of the record, that was documented and discussed, and given the weight that facts acquire when the person they involve is no longer present to contextualize them. She did not speak often about those conversations, and when she did, she was careful, and the care was not evasion. What she returned to in the years afterward, in the private accounting that artists do when they are alone and honest, was not those final conversations. It was the earlier evening, the room, the silence that turned out to be the thing rather than the absence of the thing. The guitar leaned against the wall and then picked up without ceremony. The phrase that went somewhere unexpected and resolved as if it had always known where it was going. The quality of his stillness while he played. Not concentration, not effort, simply the absence of the distance between the person and the sound the person was making. She had spent her life learning how to close that distance. She had spent her life learning how to hold a song. That evening, she had sat next to someone for whom the holding and the song were not separate things, for whom the distance she had spent decades trying to close had simply never existed. She did not know whether this was a gift or an absence, whether he had something she lacked or lacked something that had kept her from what he had. She thought about this for years and did not arrive at an answer she trusted. She had not known that was possible. She thought about it every time she sat down at the piano and found something she did not know she knew how to do, which happened more often after that evening than it had before. She never said this was the reason. She didn't have to.